Thank you. Hello, I'm Clem Bezold, the co-founder of the Public Sector Foresight Network. PSFN is a network that enables those involved in foresight for government organizations to share their aspirations, their experiences, their lessons. We are PSFN is pleased to work with the Association of Professional Futurists. This is the second in a series of highlights on foresight in leading national government activities around the world. In January, we did the Canadian and US government. Today's session will consider Korea, the Philippines, Singapore, and Malaysia. In terms of the process, the speakers, each speaker will do 15 minutes. During that time, feel free to put questions into the chat space. After the presentations, we'll curate those and get to as many as we can in the remaining time before the 90-minute end of the session. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Shermon Cruz, of the chair of the Association of Professional Futurists.
Thank you very much, Clem, for that kind introduction. As Clem has mentioned, this has been a collaborative initiative by the Public Sector Foresight Network and the Association of Professional Futurists to provide an avenue and space for public sector foresight practitioners to share their foresight work and initiatives, in the public sector. And I'm really looking forward to the session tonight. And moving this on to Nancy.
Yes, I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Seongwon Park. He's the director of the Innovative Growth Group at the National Assembly Futures Institute in South Korea. Prior to this, Dr. Park was a research fellow at Korea Science and Technology Policy Institute and received his PhD in Future Studies from the University of Hawaii at Manoa. He has numerous futures publications and research interests, which range from government and parliamentary foresight to policy planning and decision-making through foresight practices. Dr. Park will discuss parliamentary foresight in the Korean government. Welcome.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm really honored to present my thought. Let me begin with this working title, Parliamentary Foresight, an Alternative to the Addicted Growthism. I'm going to talk about first Korea's preferred future research. So South Korea's preferred future has long been anchored in economic growthism. South Korea's obsession with growth stems from its history. During the Japanese colonial era, and Korean War, Korea went through a dark period. The country was devastated, and talented people who could lead new changes were lost. Since the 1950s, the Korean government has focused all its policies and resources on economic development to overcome this situation. After the April 19 revolution in 1960, the Seongwon government collapsed, and the Jangmyeon government put forward the economy first principle to further promote economic development. It also made plans to realize the future by foreseeing the future in 3-year increments. However, when the ruling party had to deal with a period of confusion, it failed to gain the public's trust due to internal conflicts and split. So soldiers led by Park Chung-hee staged a coup and seized the power on 16 May 1961. the Park Chung-hee regime expanded the Jangmyeon government's 3-year plan into a 5-year plan and pushed radical growth through the rapid implementation of state-directed economic policies. This was an act, the conscience of North Korea, which at the time was adversary and competitor, and sought to prove through economic development that South Korea's capitalism was superior to North Korea's socialism. The economy grew rapidly in a short time by promoting such a rapid economic development plan, but the low wages and low grain prices used to fuel rapid growth led to economic and social and regional polarization, which continues to this day. In the 1980s, the name was changed from economic development to economic and social development to mitigate the harmful effects of quantitative growth, but the inertia of growthism was maintained. This didn't change the country's high dependence on foreign debt, the polarization of income, the lack of democratic checks and balance on the market. The Korean government has been engaged in foresight activities to catch up with economically developed countries. In this socio-economic context, Koreans regarded Western future studies as a tool for economic growth. So they translated Western future studies into Korean developmentology for growth-oriented vision. The table below analysis the future outlook reports published by the governments from 1990s to the mid-2010s. So you can see 4 successive governments from Kim Young-sam government up to Lee Myung-bak government, his or her term of office and title of the reports, and its time frame, and the year of publish, and national vision, like that. A feature of a government foresight over the past 20 years has been the announcement of foresight result at the end of presidential terms. Foresight inevitably includes a plan to realize a preferred future, but these plans were announced during the lame duck period of the presidency and didn't gain momentum. Another point worth noting is that the vision of the future that Korea should pursue is consistently presented as economic growth. As mentioned earlier, this is a repetition of the growth discourse. As economic values are emphasized, social and environmental values are given less consideration. It is also noteworthy that the efforts to actively gather public opinion when forecasting the future or to involve the public in the process of deriving a vision of the future have been very weak. This can also be seen as a result of a top-down convention, which has experts and government officials at its center. The participation of citizens cannot be excluded in the process of identifying the preferred future according to the results of forecasting. Analyzing whose preference it is and trying to identify and reduce the difference in preference by class is a key process in foresight. If this process is omitted, the driving force of the preferred future is lost, and the foresight report is thrown away. A preferred future with ambiguous proponents will not become reality. Successive governments have taken economic growth as the natural preferred future. However, several studies have shown that the actual preferred future of citizens is very, very different. So can you move towards a transformative future? Paradigm challenging foresight by National Assembly Futures Institute I'm working for. Through an online survey of 3,000 people and a public deliberation involving 202 citizens in 2021, the National Assembly Futures Institute envisioned a mature society as a new preferred image of the future. Some say that a mature society is a society where hair turns white because it is expressed in English. A mature society is an alternative, a state-led economic growthism based on efficiency and meritocracy. The mature society pursues social values such as equity, social trust, solidarity, and health promotion. It is a society that actively responds to biodiversity conservation and climate change. So you can see these paths. One path that Korean society has mainly chosen, growth, national growth, economic growth, focus on efficiency and meritocracy. But the other paths that Korean society intentionally neglected, individual growth, environmental preservation, and equity. The citizens who took part in the public deliberation said, quote, "The time for sacrificing everything for the sake of economic growth is over. If the water and soil die, we will die as well. Treating people like machines to achieve more growth must stop. How long will we have endless competition in a one-way society?" If you look for the origins of a mature society in English language, you will find a book, Mature Society, published in 1972 by the physicist, winner of the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1971, and thinker Denis Gabor. He argued that the task of a mature society was to restore the individual happiness, play, and leisure, and diversity that had been lost in the economic growth society. He also argued that there was an urgent need to move away from the economic growth society. Gabor's mature society was forgotten for a while, but was mentioned again in 2013 when a university established by the United Nations held a symposium on mature societies. At this conference, Cambridge University economist Partha Dasgupta criticized the practice of measuring national growth in terms of GDP, arguing for growth without compromising natural resources and personal health. He emphasized that it is a strategy for maturity that takes into account the well-being of future generations. There are also perspectives that present the vision of a mature society. This is the case in Japan, which has a low birth rate and aging population. In 2019, Yoshinori Hiroi of Kyoto University in Japan argued that Japan needs to move from urban concentration to regional deconcentration in order to become sustainable. He emphasized that a decentralized social system in which people, goods, and money circulate within a region is crucial to achieving a mature society. Having derived a mature society as the preferred future in the year 2021, in the year 2022, last year, we discussed which questions should be asked in order to realize this future society. We analyzed the current and forecasted futures of the components of a mature society, grouped into 6 areas: social relations, housing, education, economy, politics, and international relations. So these are the examples of questions from 6 areas. For example, social relations, do we compete or cooperate, or compete and isolate? Residential environment, we can ask, can we live a mentally and physically stable life wherever we live? Or economy, will Korean industry continue to grow? Or will the growth gap between small and medium enterprise and large companies continue to widen? Or international relations, the questions are, will Korea's international status and role continue to expand? Will we live on the Korean peninsula of co-prosperity, or will live on the Korean peninsula where conflict and inequality have increased? Together with experts, we analyzed past trends in each of the 6 areas. We developed a forecasting model and projected the future in 3 different directions up to 2050. We presented a scenario towards a preferred future of mature society by analyzing the content of 3 futures. Medium to long-term strategies for 2037 and top priority policies for 2027 were drawn up to realize the preferred future. Due to time constraints, I'm not going to go into the details of the forecast of what the 6 areas would be or should be for the realization of the mature society. I would like to raise a question at the end of my talk today. My question is that why hasn't democracy been at work in Korea in the process of envisioning the future, the medium to long-term strategies that society should pursue? In other words, why has citizen participation been minimized in the future visioning process? Why is the process of deliberating and choosing the vision of a nation or community not understood in the referendum held every 4 or 5 years?
Seongwon, it's your 2-minute warning.
Okay. Democracy is the political system that has been established in the Republic of Korea. All citizens have the right of suffrage and have the right to be elected. The election process and results are also transparent. People can monitor and control power through elections. However, I would argue Korea has not fully developed democracy. One of the reasons for this has to do with underdevelopment of a political society in which people can learn how to explore different futures and accordingly create and develop alternative policies and plans for the improvement of their lives. In a political society, individuals can be redefined as being political whenever they are in pursuit of alternatives to the status quo. In this sense, the word political can be reinterpreted as being actively involved in the creation of alternatives. In this sense, it is very important to develop discussions on public society, in political society in Korea. In general, a political society mediates between civil society and the state. Cohen Aracho distinguished political society from civil society by pointing out that political society deals with democratization, while civil society deals with liberalization. Some authors intend to move the locus of democratization from the state to society and strengthen new roles of diverse groups, associations, and the public and political arenas. It is my intention to explore the possibility that a political society can be fostered through the participation of lay people in foresight activities that encourage individuals to improve their self-efficacy in terms of their ability to influence their future. Okay, this is my last slide. So in short, the meaning of the establishment of NAFI and its operation for 5 years is as follows. Futures research led by National Assembly and involving all walks of life began. Moreover, citizens began to think that participation in foresight activities would make it possible to forecast the future in a way that reflected citizens' preferences, and that participation in foresight activities would increase citizen self-efficacy in relation to the future, create space for intervention in government policy, and differentiate parliamentary foresight research from the short-term partisan needs of the government. Okay, thank you, Nancy, and everyone.
Thank you very much, Seongwon. We really appreciate your presentation. I want to move on to our next speaker, who will discuss government foresight in Singapore. Cheryl Chung is head of Singapore for Kantar Public. A seasoned public sector futurist, Cheryl works at the intersection of strategic foresight and public policy, bringing 2 decades of public policy experience and expertise to the role. She has spent the majority of her career in the Singapore government, working across policy, strategy, futurist roles in various economic and infrastructure agencies. She joined Kantar Public from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, where she led strategic planning, government relations, and more lately, Program Director for Executive Education, Singapore Futures. She speaks and teaches internationally on futures thinking and public policy, and has a first-class honors degree in economics and a Master of Public Administration. Welcome, Cheryl.
Great, thank you so much for having me. Give me 2 seconds while I just drag up my slides. So I bring you all greetings from Singapore. It's getting a little late here, but I was about to say sunny Singapore. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Singapore context. I was asked to kind of give a little bit of an overview and maybe a couple of updates of how the foresight looks like in the Singapore government. But I thought, you know, I used to come from a public policy school, as Nancy mentioned, so I couldn't resist a few broader opening contexts, just because I also feel that this conversation about public sector foresight, and because you're hearing, you know, from 4 different contexts, you know, I think it's for the audience, I would really invite you guys to think a little bit about how would you compare, you know, and how each of us think about foresight work as being, I would say, in the context of our own public policy systems, right? So maybe I'll start with a few of my own assumptions. So if I can just share my screen. So one assumption I'm going to make up front is to say that all policy making is about the future. You know, and so coming to this with a lens that, you know, policy making is fundamentally about, you know, improving quality of life, economic development, you know, preserving the environment in the future. So there is a future orientation to a lot of public sector decisions that we make, right? So that's my first assumption. I think the second assumption is that the goal, therefore, of a public sector futurist is to help government make better decisions about the future today, right? And I think that present orientation and that action orientation is also a lens that I bring to this conversation. So that's my second assumption. So, you know, when you go to a public policy school, one of the first things they tell you is the policy cycle, right? They kind of shove some version of this diagram to you, and they say, well, you know, this is how the sausage is made, essentially. And then the question is, you know, how does foresight add to this policy cycle? And, you know, there is one school of thought that says, well, you know, foresight work is very useful in that upstream problem definition, agenda setting, you know, kind of part of the process, because it's something that can, you know, help you identify alternative futures. It's something that can help you set your vision, look at emerging issues, and so on. But I would again like to invite everyone to consider that, you know, futures can contribute to the discussion at every stage of the policy cycle, right? So it's one of the ways of also thinking about how foresight is not the whole of the public sector world, right? You know, but how can foresight add value to that conversation? So that's again something I invite everyone to consider as the 4 of us take you through our different contexts and our experiences in foresight in these different contexts. But at least in Singapore, you know, we kind of think about it in a couple of ways. So I collapsed the policy cycle into, you just think about it, pre-policy, policy support, and then post-policy is obviously a very loose framing. But, you know, you can think about futures much more broadly, right? So you can think about a lot of the futures tools and methodology as contributing to a pre-policy phase, which you can, I put scout and scan, right? It's a kind of horizon scanning, issues identification, emerging issues analysis kind of side of it. My second job, actually, my job just before I ended up in doing futures full-time was with the Agency for Science, Technology and Research in Singapore, which oversees a very large research and development budget. So one part of futures work was technology foresight, right? It's kind of thinking a little bit about, how do you think about the research and development priorities of the country, science and tech in this example, but could be broader. How does that actually contribute to our policy options in the future, right? By investing into research today. So that's maybe a pre-policy application of futures work. Then you can think about it as policy support, right? So policy support might look like the impact on policy development, how you frame or reframe an issue, how do you think about alternative policy options, how do you manage the complexity, ambiguity, what are the new emerging issues that might affect current policies, that might lead to the need for policy review, that kind of thing is also a way that futures can potentially support policy development. And of course, it's listed very linear on the diagram, but you think about post policy. If there's really anything like post policy, it just kind of feeds back right into this big circle. But you could also think about futures as contributing to whether it's that communication, public engagement, to understand the organizational development, the organizational design part of futures work, the change management part of futures work, and we'll talk a little bit more about potentially participatory foresight as well. But very broadly, a couple of ideas around how foresight might contribute. And I think in the Singapore context, we tend to think about it quite broadly. It may not be called futures in that I would say the narrowest definition of the term, but I think it's about future orientation, right? I think the other thing I would just want to point out is also thinking about, especially in the public sector context, and when I teach a lot of my classes, I emphasize this quite strongly. There is one aspect of futures, which is very much that I'm going to call it strategic intelligence about the future, right? So that's the finding more information, right? Finding more intelligence, about understanding the trends, how they might impact the future, whether there's evidence to support or dispute that trend, and that kind of thing. But I think an equally important part of futures work, especially in the public sector context, at least while humans are still making the decision, is that stakeholder management part, right? So it's also understanding the key decision makers and their assumptions about the future. What is that mental map? What does it look like? Where do the assumptions converge or diverge amongst the stakeholders? And I think it's this combination of both that strategic intelligence as well as, I'm just going to call it broadly, stakeholder management, that actually makes futures quite a useful strategic management tool in the context of the public sector. And there's so much of the public sector discussion which is about, increased efficiency, running it. It's very new public management, right? Like, running it more like the private sector and so on. But there's part of the goal of public sector is also resilience and robustness, right? Greater adaptability for future challenges and all that. So we have to kind of balance these two things, right? And I think this is also where futures can play quite a useful and interesting role in the conversation. So again, just to frame a couple of thoughts as you're listening to all our presentations, a couple of, you can think about these national kind of foresight systems and government foresight systems, as having a few different elements. I leave the slide to your reading, but essentially thinking about where's the demand coming from, where's the expertise, where are the institutions, and you'll hear a number of the institutions that we've all been affiliated with or represent. How integrated is it in the policy system? What are the different touch points, and how is it evaluated, right? What's the impact? So these are, again, things to kind of think a little bit about as we kind of go through some of these examples. Which brings me very quickly to the Singapore experience. So I'm going to talk through a very quick history, and then we can talk through a little bit about, I guess, where I see some of the characteristics and a couple of trends going forward, because we're futures people after all. So I think a few quick history lesson In Singapore, we've been doing foresight work for quite a long time. It started in the early 90s. We were very inspired by Shell and their practice of using scenarios in their strategy and decision making. So very early on, we set up a scenario planning branch in MINDEF. MINDEF is our Ministry of Defense. And, it started off with the objective of, like defense procurement, right? Thinking about these large investments that you make, into the to protect the existence of your country, and kind of thinking about it from that perspective. So that's where it started, like a little setup in the Ministry of Defense. And after a while, they realized that, actually, this tool is quite useful, and may have a broader public sector application. So in the mid-90s, then they set up a national level, and national level. Singapore is a small city state. Okay, so manage your expectations about when I say national, how big is national? But they set up a scenario planning office in the Public Service Division, which is essentially under the Prime Minister's office, and focuses very much on, the people aspects of the public sector. I'll talk a bit more about that later. And then about 10 years after that, the Scenario Planning Office renamed to the Strategic Policy Office, and then a few years after that, set up the Center for Strategic Futures, which has become quite well known. I think one important point to note here is that when they set up the Center for Strategic Futures, it was really kind of also thinking about broader than just scenarios as a foresight tool, right? So previous iterations of that was very focused on one tool, fairly comprehensive tool, no doubt, but that was their specialization, right? And when they set up the center, it became a much more broad-based approach to futures work, which I think is something important to note. The other thing which I didn't list on the slide was that in that period, there were also many, many more foresight teams that started to set up. So between, I would say the late 2000s onwards, there were many other teams that started to do futures work within the Singapore government. So one of the more prominent ones would be the one from the Ministry of Trade and Industry that focuses very much on industry development. There are others. I will talk through a URA, Urban Redevelopment Authority example later on. I've worked in the transport team when they were setting up. So, there's one at transport. So there's been a sort of proliferation of these foresight teams. They're quite small, but nevertheless, I think contribute to a network of government foresight units within the Singapore government. And then later on, and actually before I forget, I'm just going to put in the chat the link to the Center for Strategic Futures website. They do a pretty good job of sharing the stuff that they do that's available to be shared publicly. So there are quite a lot of, links to speeches and publications and so on, and so please take a look at that in your own time. It's quite a nice resource. And then in about 10 years or so ago, the Strategic Policy Office got incorporated into Strategy Group in the Prime Minister's office, right? So also being much closer to this, I would say, the center of power, right? And coordinating also in the policy, being more plugged into the policy coordination roles, at least in Singapore. So that's something quickly that we could kind of a quick, over the last 30 years or so, world tour of Singapore foresight, at least in government. So I mentioned they started with these scenarios. So the core product was this thing called the national scenarios, which is a document and kind of exercise that is done every, I would say, 5 years or so. This particular news article was from the very first set, which was done in 1997. And I think a couple of things which I would just like to point out. And I should say that firstly, this is the set that was made public. All the subsequent national scenarios have become internal documents. But what they do now is they share quite openly the driving forces, which is quite nice. You can find that on the Center for Strategic Futures website that I just shared as well. But I think the other thing which is nice to take into account is that, you know, it was because it was under the Public Service Division, and that there's a conversation about actually why would a government adopt foresight, right? And there's one reason, which is to say that you're also looking at public sector transformation itself, right? So you basically you think to yourself, well, you know, as a public sector, what do we need to be able to serve the country in the future? You know, what are the capabilities? What are the things we need to be aware of? And there is a non-trivial internal organizational change process, you know, that's actually really quite hard. Yeah. So I do find it quite interesting that at least in the Singapore context, you know, you would put at least in the beginning, the foresight work in the public sector, you know, essentially the HR ministry, you know, and that was one of the reasons, right? Is because really this integration between, it was part of a much larger movement called Public Service 21, which is the head of the title of the article, to really think about what a future-oriented public service, you know, public service for 21st century, what does that need to look like?
Hello, Cheryl. This is your friendly 2-minute warning.
Okay. So I will not go through the national scenarios, given that I only have 2 minutes, but what I would say is that in the Singapore context, we do share the driving forces. So please take a look. So two national scenarios ago, the driving forces look something like this, where we might look at a particular issue and make an assessment about where we are, what we know, what we don't know. There's also work that is done, which is the national scenarios are, you know, kind of, I would say routine and scheduled and a very disciplined, large exercise, but there's also work that is a bit more topical. So this is an example of a version of a futures wheel done in the very early days of COVID to try to make sense of actually what we were dealing with and what were some of the longer term impacts. So again, something that you can look at on the CSF website. Maybe it's a good point for me to take my last minute / 30 seconds to talk about two quick trends that I think is happening at least within Singapore. So typically, when you think about the Singapore foresight model, at least within government, you know, that you tend to associate it with a few things. So one is that's quite centralized, you know, there's the existence of quite a strong central agency in the Prime Minister's office. You know, it tends, and it's a network model, right? So it's got this big agency and then smaller agencies around it. You also tend to feel that it's you know, kind of, you know, staffed by bureaucratic elite, right? You know, it's in the Prime Minister's office, you know, there's a certain tone and kind of a gravitas to it. But I think a conversation that has been coming to the fore is really very similar to what's happening in Korea, I would say, is also this question about public engagement, right? What does foresight look like when you democratize foresight methodology, when you, you know, kind of engage citizens a little bit more? So this is a screenshot from a conversation with the Urban Redevelopment Authority, where they do a lot of long-term master planning. I will share the toolkit in the chat in a little bit. But what they did was, as part of this big exercise, you know, also talked about the participatory elements of how to think about what our city will look like in the future. And Singapore being very, very land scarce, you know, it's a critical policy issue. The last trend I'll talk about is also thinking about how the public sector works with the rest of society. So I think for a very long time, one of the criticisms of the Singapore model would be that it is very public sector focused, which is true in Singapore in general. You know, it's a strong state, right? So, but I think one question is that the future belongs to all of us, right? And how do we also level up the conversation in the non-state, you know, parts of society, right? So this is one example of many that have emerged in, I would say, the last 5 years or so, where, you know, there have been different projects done on, you know, from Singapore with, you know, this one is an Asia-focused one, but, you know, it basically focusing on foresight for society, right? As opposed to just having it as a government conversation, and then not led by, you know, the Center for Strategic Futures and so on, but with their participation or, you know, resources and so on, you know, as resource persons. And I think that to me, at least, has been quite a positive development, at least in our context, because that's one of the things I would like to see, right? As government foresight work kind of progresses, is that it's a strong node, but it's also part of a wider network of foresight done in the country. I'll leave my comments there and happy to take questions later on. I'll put a couple of links in the chat in a bit. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Cheryl. And now we'll ask Nancy to introduce Shermon. Nancy, you're muted.
Thank you, Clem. I'm honored to introduce Shermon Cruz, who will discuss government foresight in the Philippines. He is the founder, executive director, and chief futurist of the Center for Engaged Foresight, a futures innovation and strategic foresight hub operating globally based in Manila. He is currently the chair of the Millennium Project Philippines Node and chairperson of the Association of Professional Futurists. Also a PhD candidate at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Australia. Shermon is a senior consultant and foresight advisor to national government agencies. To give some examples, Asian Development Bank, National Economic Development Authority, Department of Health, Department of Science and Technology, the Philippine Public Safety College, Philippine Navy, and USAID, among others. Thank you, Shermon. We look forward to your discussion.
Thank you very much, Nancy. So let me begin by providing you some sort of an overview of the updates of what's going on as far as foresight in the Philippines is concerned. So there are four elements or things that drives foresight initiatives and investments by the government on strategic foresight and futures thinking today. One is, of course, awareness. Spreading the knowledge and the information that, hey, there is an idea of what we call futures thinking, and that has been widespread, particularly in state universities. Second is the development of competencies, particularly in the civil service. So there has been several initiatives funded and spearheaded by the government in key government agencies in the Philippines today, wherein they have started building their capabilities and competencies as civil servants that would eventually, for some government agencies, led to the creation of the agency's Futures Thinking Office. And the third one is research. There has been initiatives, programs, and projects, again, supported by the government, wherein professors who are interested in futures thinking, in strategic foresight, has the support, of the government agencies by providing them opportunities and funding to learn research, particularly in futures and foresight. And the fourth one is the attempt of at least two national government agencies, particularly the Department of Health and the National Economic Development Authority, to institutionalize foresight at the strategic, tactical, and operational levels of the organizations. And of course, last but not the least, is of course the application of foresight tools and methodologies and the scenarios by which hopefully it could inform the conversation and provide options and strategies, ideas for policymakers, grappling with, of course, potential futures of the different public policy issues and domains, like, for example, transportation, cities, climate change, public health, among others. So those are the ongoing initiatives by the Philippine government currently. And I'm going to talk a bit more of that, provide you some case studies later on. But at this point, I would like to share to you perhaps some history of foresight in the Philippines. When I was doing some literature review way back in 2012, I saw that there were like around 4 compelling papers that I would say could be considered as some sort of the initial papers on foresight in the Philippines, at least published. One, it was the book of the former president, President Ferdinand Marcos, in his book, The Filipino Society. There are at least 2 pages dedicated wherein the former president discussed alternative futures. And he was suggesting back then, that was around in the 1980s, that this is something that we need to learn. Ways by which we could actually some sort of develop scenarios of alternative futures for the Philippines. But then the people power happened. And then I tried to contact those, have a conversation with those people who were supporting him in that initiative. So President Marcos had the idea, intent of creating a futures office within the office of the president during his period, but then the people power happened. He was ousted, and those people who actually was pushing the creation of a futures thinking office during that time would create their own organization that would become some sort of a futurist society in the Philippines way back in the 1980s. And the members of those group would eventually become the ministers or the secretaries of the succeeding presidents, wherein President Ramos, during his time, would introduce, through his secretary of the National Economic Development Authority, introduce the scenario approach, to building the President Ramos agenda of what we now call historically as the Philippines 2000 agenda. So it was during that time, it was an era wherein the Philippines was recovering from the implications and consequences, both negatively, from the disruption that the country experienced post the people power event. And then, of course, I also learned that one of those literature that I would find was published by Swahila Nayatula, wherein back then he was still a student of political science at the University of Hawaii, wherein President Marcos would eventually be exiled, would prompt an interest, for him to write he told me about this, one of his 5 publications as a foresight practitioner was his pamphlet. It's not actually a book, at a scenario wherein he tried to explore some alternative futures for the Philippines 20 years after. And of course, I would also learn that Tony Stevenson, who was a futurist based in Australia, would partner with Cesar Villanueva, who was the former Secretary General of the World Future Studies Federation, develop some series of essays wherein foresight can be introduced at the community level, specifically dealing with those issues, particularly on fisher folk issues and farmers. In fact, Tony Stevenson, would use this metaphor of typhoon, as some sort of, let's just say, in the context of alternative futures, a collapse scenario for the country, wherein typhoon would emerge as a metaphor that portrays the existential, not necessarily the existential risk, I'm sorry about that, but the risk and threats that might disrupt, the country politically, and at least in the context of climate change. But then, of course, he was also referring that perhaps the only way for the country, at least from his view, spiral into something transformative would be the values that the Filipinos has, that Filipinos are actually full-spirited and courageous, at least in that context. I've been trying to find that literature, but I could not longer find it on Google. And then, of course, there will be several columns that would be published in national dailies recurringly, at least perhaps in the last 20 years. And then eventually today, in fact, before the pandemic happened, 2 years before that, the Senate of the Philippines would create the Committee on the Sustainable Development Goals, Innovation and Futures Thinking. 2 years before that, the conversation that they were having at the Senate was about the SDGs and innovation, particularly. But then when the pandemic happened, they started asking, what exactly is this futures thinking all about? And it was chaired by Senator Pia Cayetano. And then, of course, in collaboration with his office, we would invite foresight practitioners from all around the world, to share what they know about futures and foresight, and that would be recurring for the next 2 years. And that would eventually create an opportunity for the Senate to fund a future, to invest and put funding and include investments on futures thinking and strategic foresight, and it's now a part of the country's General Appropriations Act that would fuel, power the initiative in the different national government agencies who are into it, like, for example, the Department of Science and Technology, who recently, in collaboration with the National Academy for Science and Technology, published the first foresight report of the country, really comprehensively, at least in the context of trends and emerging issues, a little bit of alternative futures, preferred definitely by the National Academy of Science and Technology. It would be a 2-year project, which I was privileged to be a part of that initiative, and would involve around 600 folks all over the Philippines, primarily the scientists of the country, particularly on the future of science, technology, and innovation in the Philippines. And today, the DOST, or the Department of Science and Technology, has a Futures Thinking Office. They created a 3-position civil service position, to sustain the initiative, and it's becoming even more widespread. And they have now initiated a national initiative wherein they have started providing awareness and competency training, including scenario workshops at all levels, from the directors, from the undersecretaries, to the program managers of the department. It's ongoing until today, and that is also evident in the Department of Health. So the Department of Health is one of the key agencies of the national government. We've seen that, of course, they played really a significant role during the pandemic, and they were one of those departments that would take, that opportunity to start and trigger foresight within the Department of Health, in partnership, of course, in partnership with the Senate and the World Health Organization. And just recently, they also created a Futures Thinking Office, and they've been providing training, at least internally now, and they wish to make it widespread, at least for the entire Department of Health. And what's pretty quite a novel as far as the Department of Health is concerned is that the initiative started and began with the application, or perhaps an initiative that measures the maturity of the organization, whether or not the agency is ready for futures. So a strategic foresight maturity assessment index was conducted, and that index would inform the planning, for foresight integration in the department, particularly on 2 things. One is, of course, policy and program management, and the second is embedding strategic foresight within the organization. And the members, when they conducted the survey, it involved, at least for now, at the highest level of the department. And they continue to provide training and make futures thinking widespread all over the Department of Health, which hopefully would eventually justify and legitimize, again, hopefully in terms of funding and resources, support by the government, and of course other partner agencies, like, for example, the Asian Development Bank, World Health Organization, USAID, East-West Leadership Academy, among ASEAN, among other partners that the government agencies has, particularly in Asia, including Australia, I believe, and New Zealand, is the institutionalization of strategic foresight within the department. So other than that, of course, there are some initiatives that has been going on, particularly some step-by-step things that the other agencies are doing to accentuate futures thinking, strategic foresight in the Philippine government, particularly in the Armed Forces of the Philippines, the Philippine Navy, the Philippine Public Safety College, and the universities, from the Department of Health, the Commission on Higher Education, And in fact, today, the government has provided some initial funding for futures thinking, future studies and research to around, if I'm not mistaken, like around more or less 100 state universities in the country. So it's becoming widespread. And then, of course, we will see, what emerges from this initiative that has been going on. And not only that, as mentioned by Cheryl as well, that it should not just be, I think we're learning as well in that context that we should go beyond the government-centric approach when it comes to public sector foresight. And there is an agency or an institution, educational institution, it's a business school in the Philippines, Asian Institute of Management, that has also taken the initiative, to provide support, to local government units and companies and corporations operating in the Philippines. So the companies and corporations who are providing public services, service, particularly on energy, on renewable energy, mobility, among other things, and more often than not, you have the corporations and companies providing support to the government, especially when they outsource things that they cannot do, has also started embarking on an initiative wherein they start sending their people to learn futures thinking and foresight, and they get their credentials at the Asian Institute of Management. So
just your friendly 2-minute warning.
Okay, thank you very much. So to wrap it up, it's in the Philippines, it's an ongoing initiative. Right. But then, of course, things perhaps that what the country needs to do at this point is, once the competencies are there and the scenario development is currently ongoing. And this, I think, is the support that the Philippines would require is actually the production of knowledge, right? Sustainability of this initiative. Because when, political actors or decision makers changes, in the process, you always get to see some sort of challenges as far as the continuity of these initiatives, particularly on, when government are in a transition, right? And I think that's the thing that, governments need to look at as far as perhaps the short-term future of futures in the Philippines, perhaps I would say in the next 5 to 7 years. Back to you, Clem.
Thank you, Sherman. So Nancy will now introduce Rushdi.
Yes, it's my pleasure to introduce Rushdi Rahim, who will discuss government foresight in Malaysia. He is the Deputy Chief Executive Officer in the Malaysian Industry Government Group for High Technology, better known by the acronym MIGHT. This is a partnership technology policy think tank under the purview of the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Innovation. Rushdi has led the completion of major foresight and futures initiatives that shaped Malaysia's national policy development. Just to provide a few examples, Future Rail 2030, a foresight project for the development of rail industry in Malaysia. The future of the Malaysian public service beyond 2020, a collaborative project with the United Nations Development Program and the Public Service Department, and the future of work, workforce, and workplace, and other great examples. Welcome, Rushdi. We appreciate your speaking to us.
Yep, thank you very much. I'm trying to share my screen, but will the organizer allow me to share the screen?
Yes, you should be able to.
Yep. Okay. All right. Now, after hearing the other speakers talking about, and I'm glad we've discussed about this, and I'm going to specifically talk about the Malaysian experience because we've covered a lot with regards to some of the theories, some of the applications of how foresight is being done in government and where it's headed. I'm going to talk specifically with regards to the Malaysian context and specifically with regards to the organizations that I'm from, which is MIGHT. Well, now, to understand the start or the beginning of foresight in Malaysia, as well as my organization. You should understand that my organization is a partnership technology think tank established in 1993, specifically to undertake actually foresight and future studies. So basically, we were created to undertake foresight and future studies in Malaysia. Now, as mentioned just now, we are a government agency at present under the purview of the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation. Why we put at present? Because throughout the changes in the government, we've been actually moved around. Although we've been moved around, however, our work in terms of foresight and future studies has remained intact, remained relevant, because those are the mandate why we were created. And if you notice, the name is actually Malaysian Industry Government Group for High Technology. Industry government. That means although we're a government entity, we are a partnership organization. So we have two chairmen, one representing the government and one representing captains, representing a captain representing the industry. Okay? Now, you notice the word technology there. So as a start, this is our first chairman, Omar Abdul Rahman, who was the science advisor to the Malaysia Force Prime Minister, the founding joint chairman of MIGHT. So what he says about foresight is actually MIGHT has an important role to play, bringing industry players together to anticipate and identify emerging technology problems. So from the start, we were asked to do engagement, participatory engagement with industry players to anticipate and identify emerging technology problems and the application of technologies for their solution. So it started with that. And why? And you can see for the last 30 years, since 1993, we've done a lot of broad-based multi-ministerial policy formulation, policy facilitation and engagement. And the pictures on your right is actually some of the highlights and covers of things that we've done, looking at foresight and future studies, where we create national blueprints and roadmap, creation of industrial technology park, entrepreneurship, technology priorities and advancement, as well as talent development. Now, bear in mind, our work consists of bottom-up or top-down. Bottom-up, that means from our horizon scanning, due to the fact that we do a lot of horizon scanning, trends-based analysis. So we instigate the government into building policies around a topic or an issue. Or it could be top-down. That means the powers that be, the political masters, identify an issue that needs to be addressed, and we are engaged to do foresight work on that particular topic. Now, as I was saying, as a start, we were looking at very much high-tech. And why high-tech matters? Well, for the last 10 years, Malaysia has been among the top 15 countries in the world in terms of high-tech export. So the value, if you notice in the slide, for 2020 and 2021 has increased. So for the last 10 years, we've been playing there. So the idea is very much at the beginning, when we were doing foresight, we were looking at very much at high-tech and the high-tech industrial sectors. And we have been doing continuous review to anticipate the issues and needs for industrial growth. And the focus and emphasis for MIGHT differs after a non-definitive period, because where we only have about 80 people, and our focus in each sector actually changes emphasis on it, because we keep reviewing as we go along, and depending on the take-up and attention given by the government or businesses. For example, if the idea of our focus is very much for businesses to take up the mantle. Once business focus on it, we look for the next best thing. We look for the other things. So we don't specifically spend too much time after a few years to actually spend resources on that particular sector. And the use of foresight at MIGHT is actually multi-pronged. In general, foresight we use to facilitate the following: identify future opportunities, barriers and risks, critical thinking into the development of some of these areas. Of course, I was mentioning with regards to participatory engagement, and we shape the future through policy intervention and creation. Now, output could be categorized into the following: could be exploratory or prescriptive. Exploratory includes scenarios, strategic white papers, commentaries or articles that we give to government platforms, national councils. Prescriptive is very much policy framework, roadmaps, blueprints, or strategic white papers in those forms. And you can't do foresight without collaborating. That is something that's very apparent. Now, our work has involved, we've worked with a lot of ministries within Malaysia, but also we've done a lot of work collaborating with other institutions outside of Malaysia as well. This includes, as you can see, UNDP, Asia Productivity Organization, and World Health Organization, as well as ministries and agencies from the following countries that you see on the right. So we do a lot of Delphi studies or horizon scanning or trends analysis with these particular countries. And on your left is actually some of the big corporate organizations within Malaysia. And I think in general, the process and approach for all countries would be the same. I think everybody is aware, you know, the policy and guidance development plan using foresight method of process could be carved into these three phases where you diagnose, prognose, and prescription. So I won't dwell on this because you know, I think it has been covered by previous speakers as well. But what I would like to emphasize is actually in Malaysia, methods, because methods are chosen to signify the needs to cater adoption for case studies. So you can't apply the same methods and tools across every sectors, every areas, every focus. So selection and combination of methods are made to ensure the best outcome and participation of stakeholders. This include but not limited to negate, of course, the high level of cynicism of the stakeholders. Because sometimes when you talk about the future, sometimes they tend to think, you know, oh, you know, let's talk about today. No, and of course to enable change of thinking and mindset, incorporate discipline and subjectivity, ensure engagement of diverse, equal distribution of participants, of course to the need to sustain continued interest in foresight exercise, and we like to use multi-tools in the environment of workshops or engagement that we're doing. And these are among the tools that we use in general: horizon scanning, wind tunneling, future will benchmark workshop. I think if you look through the literature, there's about 75 tools and methods that was listed by Raphael Popper in his universal foresight work. And we generally in MIGHT, we generally use a lot of these 12 things. And I think the only thing that is very exclusive to us is the first matrix that you can see there, which is on the first row, number 3 there. So that's very much something that we developed here in Malaysia, something that developed here in MIGHT, and we use this a lot as well. And you might be wondering, what is first? Well, the first metric is actually developed using a 360 approach to view at the ecosystem support, because whenever we look at policy prescription, what will be the enabling tool for government, we realize that, you know, first is represented in this following, you know, funding and financial, ensuring that the necessary funding and financial mechanism, incentive to support the deployment of initiative. I would be infrastructure or institution, identify the required infrastructure or institution that will be responsible to the deployment of the initiative. Of course, regulation and policies, because we come from the government, the need for the right regulation and policies to support the development of whatever we need. Skills and talent. And although as you can see, although we're a technology-based think tank, technology comes last, because we think funding, infrastructure, regulation, skills, then the technology would come in. But, you know, not in the order of priority, of course, definitely with this guys. And for the last 30 years, in terms of technology, we've looked into various types of technology. The following are just some of the highlights: nanotech, advanced, solar, electronic, pharmaceutical, composite, sensor technology, photonics, MEMS, herbal, and green chemicals. These are just some of the things that we've looked at, and we've created blueprints or roadmaps or white papers and provided to the government of Malaysia. And does it matter? Now that is a question that I'm always asked. What if we don't use foresight? Well, with regards to foresight, the use of foresight has enabled improved decision making. Why? Through 1, engagement of multidisciplinary and diverse stakeholders. 2, systemic outlook. Of course, establishing a shared vision and shared fears derived from multi-scenarios that we use. The use of scenario workshop also allows the discussion of politically sensitive matters, because whenever we create a workshop, a foresight workshop is basically a safe space for people to discuss about things and uncover opportunities and risks, which was not previously discussed. identification of wildcards and weak signals, and of course, tests of existing strategies against scenarios that was developed. Now, one of the things that was talked about, I think Cheryl touched about it, and I think Sherman touched about it as well. The benefit of foresight, it should not be just limited to the use in technology. So, of course, that even happened in my picture is the science advisor to the 6th Prime Minister. He understands that the use of these tools is good. Then he instructed us to expand the use for beyond technology. Hence, the creation of a Malaysian Foresight Institute under the purview of MIGHT to allow MIGHT to pursue and conduct foresight initiatives and services to non-technology centric organizations in Malaysia, as well as private and public institutions. And this has allowed us to pursue some of this work that we would not have pursued before. For example, the future of Malaysian public service, where we collaborated with the Public Service Department, looking at public service transformation, chart the way forward for public service, and it provides an input into the Malaysia National Development Plan. And of course, future of work, we presented to the Cabinet Committee, highlight the impact or implication of the 4th Industrial Revolution, instigate further action and policy response by the respective ministries. We look at future of youth for the Ministry of Youth and Sports to identify type of youth that would survive and thrive in the future. The idea was actually to develop the training programs required to ensure that the youth are prepared to face the future. We look at future of consumers for the Ministry of Domestic Trade and Consumer Affairs to look at common objective for development of distributive trade industry. And of course, manufacturing futures for the Ministry of International Trade and Industry to develop policy framework for the National Industry 4.0 strategies and action plan. And one of the things that's out there is actually we also done scenarios for corruptions actually, when we were building the National Anti-Corruption Plan, we were building what would be the new type of corruption that could be in the future. And those are something that is beyond the technology foresight that we've done previously.
Hello, Rushdi. This is your friendly 2-minute warning.
Yep, thank you very much. Yep. However, it's not without the challenges conducting foresight. I'm not saying it's smooth sailing. Well, I'll just touch on these 3 things. The use of foresight, these are some of the main challenges in government. One is low-hanging fruits and quick wins. There is an expectation that you provide instant result. So low-hanging fruits and quick wins is not the friend of foresight. Second is capability to anticipate, which is capability to do foresight does not mean there is a willingness to act. Sometimes you anticipate, but the willingness to act upon anticipating these things does not happen. And then, of course, from scenarios to strategy and action. Sometimes you build those scenarios, the translation of scenarios to strategy and action is not there. And foresight done right. I think these are the 6 things. I won't read from it. You can see it for yourself. These are the 6 things that I think that whenever a foresight done right, you would achieve all these 6 things. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you very much, Rushdi. That was great. That was great for all of the speakers. Nancy, do you want to start curating some questions?
Yes, I'm going to start with a question for Seongwon. If you could discuss what are some of the lessons learned from parliamentary foresight, the National Assembly's Futures Institute, that would be relevant for other countries?
Thank you, Nancy, for the question. A wonderful question. Since we founded it 5 years ago, so it's very brand new institute, and we still have concerns from lawmakers, whether our institution is working or not. So I can say that there are 3 concerns from the lawmakers. Number 1 is that they have a concern that the futures research dealing with mid to long-term strategies in the single 5-year administration may collide with the government. Members of the parliament said that in a country with a single 5-year presidential term in Korea, what the president can do is limited. But if the Futures Institute comes up with a long-term strategy, policy priorities may change, and the opposition party will try to attack the government based on the long-term strategy. This is kind of typical concern from the lawmakers and from the government. And the second concern that I can say that the issue of political neutrality regarding research topics and results of NAFI. So I can quote from one parliamentary member. He or she said that reunification, welfare, and public servant pension issues are nationally important issue, but there are many controversies. So if the National Assembly Futures Institute research results differ from our party's ideology, he said that we will be shocked. In this concern, that we answered that the NAFI will conduct the futures research by narrowing down to topics agreed upon by the ruling and opposition parties. And we are not providing a study that provides a single answer, but a variety of social conflict structures or difficult problems. So we'll provide a base for advancing intellectual consensus. And the three issues that we have from the lawmakers, they said that Futures Institute, NAFI, should pursue collaboration with civil society. They said that a country without a future vision presented by citizens' consensus has no future. So the lawmakers asked NAFI to gather citizens to envision the national vision or prefer future. So these are kinds of lessons from 5 years experience.
Oh, well, thank you very much. Clem and I have had different interactions with NAFI, including a presentation at one of our earlier meetings at their inception, and it's just a very impressive endeavor from the legislative parliamentary perspective. My next question is for Cheryl. How does foresight feed into strategy making in the government? Is there an oversight body that helps translate possible future scenarios to concrete strategies for government?
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for that question. To be honest, my first thought when the question was posed was really this, it's like, how do you make organizational structures also fit for purpose, right? Also adaptable to the future. And I think that that's one of the challenges that we have in government, in terms of organizational design. So maybe I'll answer the question in a few ways. I think the first one is to really think about it. When we talk about government foresight, we always think, you say like bottom up or top down, centralized, decentralized, these are different models. There are pros and cons to both, right? And I think that depending on which foresight system you come from, you do need to think about it in different ways. So in the Singapore model, I would say there is a centralized unit, a foresight unit called the Center for Strategic Futures, which I mentioned, and then the decentralized units within many of the ministries and bigger agencies. So to be honest, it's not a top-down approach. It is actually more networked model in that, you're trying to reduce the information asymmetry about the future, because even when you think about the Center for Strategic Futures, and the work that they do, the reality is we're talking about a 12 to 15 person team, looking at coordinating across government. There's a lot of cost and transaction costs to that level of coordination, which actually becomes quite difficult. And having done foresight both at the central government side and what we call a line ministry, I would say that one challenge is, of course, that when you do the good thing about having a centralized agency is that, they can provide, I'm going to call it a bit of a public good function, right? Invest in things which are difficult to do from a line ministry perspective. So for example, you might invest in training, you might invest in overall government kind of frameworks, you might invest in a set of national scenarios that, agencies can then translate lower down, right? You can invest in network building. These are things which are hard, for you sitting in the Ministry of Transport or Health or somewhere else to do on the whole of government level. So those are what central agencies are good at doing. If I can be a bit self-critical, then where they're not so good is understanding really the nitty-gritty or policy problems down the line, because obviously, that's difficult unless you really explode the size of the team. But when I was at the Ministry of Transport, we were like a 4-person team looking at air, land, and sea, which is very, very small. With friends at the Center for Strategic Futures, which is like a 15-person team, it's the best thing you can do is be a good and efficient information exchange, right? It's very difficult to do a lot of that oversight kind of coordination work, and in my view tends to bloat the government, the size of the government. So I think that's a few things I would say. Maybe the last thing just to say is that then the networking components and the overall platforms and structures that you invest in the public service become really, really important, right? So in the Singapore context, they both do senior level, kind of futures, I would say committees essentially, but they also do that at the working level, which is much more about sharing the director's cut of the projects, it's making it easy to have the phone a friend option across government. I think those are also intangible structures that we do invest in as well. Yeah, I hope that answers the question. Thanks.
Yes, thank you very much. There's a really fascinating question that Victor Mati post, and I wanted to start with Sherman and then get Rushdi's comments on this question. Are there any systemic relations between government foresight in Korea, Singapore, Philippines, and Malaysia with the visions and foresight projects done by the Chinese government? Do you try to align, make sense, compete, collaborate with the vision of China for the future? Specifically, Malaysia's, is it collaborating with China? If not, is that because China is close to the outside world? So if I could start with Sherman, if you would like to comment on this, or if you prefer to answer another question about what the national government in the Philippines can do to encourage foresight at the local level. I'll leave it up to you.
Yes, I'm going to answer that. Definitely, there are no such thing as systemic relations yet, right? Between and among countries when it comes to futures and foresight. But not systemic, but as in the context of network and interface and foresight exchange between, of course, colleagues and governments in Asia. And more often than not, those exchanges happen at the Asia Pacific Futures Network, right, at the APFN. And in fact, the next APFN will be held in Malaysia this year or sometime around September. And not only governments, in fact, that are involved in that process of exchange, you also have other partners participating, in that exchange. Like, for example, the Asian Development Bank, the embassies who are supportive of these initiatives, including, of course, persons and individuals and companies and corporations are also doing foresight work and would like to learn from the experiences of the other institutions' initiative as far as foresight work is concerned, at least in the public sector. Now, but there are specific issues and agenda wherein actually foresight exchange also occurs other than the network format. You have the ASEAN, who is facilitating foresight initiatives that involves members of the ASEAN countries. For example, just recently, I think last year was about the future of water. Yeah. So these ministries and agencies who participated in that ASEAN organized initiative, would share, their scenarios of the future about the future of water or perhaps the blue economy for that matter. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Rushdi, would you like to provide any comments on that question from Victor?
Yep, I think we do some collaborative work with the Chinese Academy of Sciences, especially in the area of foresight, technology foresight. I think it boils down to we do the foresight in the countries first, understanding the needs of Malaysia. And of course, then we reach out to our Chinese counterpart and you see, then identify where are the technology hotspots or where are the technology development that is worth collaborating with. So then, of course, as I said, we reach out to our counterparts in China, in Turkey, in Russia. It depends. So I don't think there is in MIGHT we live by this three mantra, three C's. We said it. We start off with conversation, then we collaborate, then we co-create. So it always starts with a conversation, then you collaborate, then hopefully we can co-create certain things. So I think Sherman answered correctly. There is no systemic development there, but of course there is a reaching out, and of course sharing of notes between the countries, because bear in mind what works in Malaysia does not necessarily work in the Philippines. What works in Singapore does not necessarily work in Malaysia. I think Cheryl touched it about Singapore being an island state, whereas we're I think about 450 times bigger than Singapore. And if you go to Philippines, they are more big, they are larger. And if you go to Indonesia, they are much more larger. So the context of the needs and wants of each country differs. But I think it's very important for each country to look at what their needs and requirements, then reach out to partners to actually collaborate and co-create.
Well, thank you very much. We're coming to the close of our session. It's just been a fascinating set of presentations, and I want to thank APF for suggesting this as a theme for a collaborative event between APF and the Public Sector Foresight Network, and special thanks to Nicole Perena for important organizational aspects of this meeting as well. And of course, to Sherman for his continuing leadership and support of this joint effort. On behalf of the Public Sector Foresight Network, Clem, Bezold, and ourselves, we would like to thank you for attending. As I mentioned in the chat, there's some great questions in the chat. Number of questions about references people would like provided. And I'll work with Nicole and the speakers to see what we can put together and provide to those who have attended. I'm now going to turn it over to Sherman for some closing comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Nancy. Again, I would like to thank Cheryl, Rushdi, and Seongwon, and of course, Clem and Nancy for this continuing initiative that we have. And then we intend to continue this further, and hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you very much, and good evening.
Thank you.